drama, and her work in picture books is also incredibly well known. And one of the ideas behind Banksia Initiative is that we would have processes and practices that teachers could use first day back, and then further on into responding to kids' needs and what they require as part of their education. Robyn's going to talk to us about picture books and how they're useful in that context. Please welcome Robyn.
Well, I know that you've been seated for a long time, so I'm going to try and be as brief as possible. And I'm not just going to talk about picture books. I'm going to talk about the absolute importance of quality, imaginative literature. That every child and every teacher and every parent, often the literary arts are left out of discussions about the arts, and yet they are the art form that at least 80% of Australians will say they know something about. Fictional literature, reading, sharing, talking about imaginative literature is really important for who we are as human beings. At every point during our lives, and yet sometimes in my experience, it's imaginative literature that gets left out. Or we might read it and just deliver a series of comprehension questions afterwards, which isn't going to go anywhere. I could have the conversation now about what do I mean by quality, imaginative literature. I do have PowerPoint that I'm very happy to share later. There just wasn't time today. But I guess now it's important to say that we have a huge amount of research evidence about the importance of fictional literature for who we are and why that's important. So picture books, fantasy, fairy tales, poems, realistic and historical fiction, traditional myths and legends from different cultures. As some have said already, it helps us develop, first of all, our knowledge of ourselves, then more knowledge about others, and also knowledge about the world more broadly. And that comes from Vygotsky, but also from Aidan Chambers and the fairy godfather of children's literature, Maury Saxby, who said, imaginative narration holds a crucial part in the self-development of most responsive human beings. So a lot of the neuroscience now talks about those young people who have had opportunities to read imaginative fiction are much more likely to be empathetic, much more likely to be compassionate, much more likely to want to do something in their small corner of the world. And I'm very happy to give you, references to those studies if you like them. So while in that first tranche, Dr. John Saunders and I suggested some quality literature, both picture books and novels, that do have some bushfire content. It doesn't have to be that you'll start or even go to that place. A teacher needs to go to quality literature for the kinds of broad key concepts that the teachers decided are really important for those early preschoolers, children in primary school, or young adults. Often, those books are layered. That means they will talk to the early learners, but even the mature age learners like me will take something deep and meaningful away. Maury Saxby said, something you can read at 7 and really gain a lot from, and then at 77 and gain probably something different, but really important as well. So my plea is that every day, not just on the first day of school, but every day there is time to share quality literature together and to talk about it. And it will often go places where you weren't expecting it to go as the teacher. But alongside that, work with your parent community as well about the importance of quality of literature. Reading with their children, not getting their children to read to them. It's not about their children's reading performance. It's about the opportunity to share together and to talk about really important issues, whatever they may be. And often that there will be connection to things that a child is worried about or concerned about, etc. I guess the other thing to say is that quality literature challenges us cognitively. So that's really important as well. It leads us to ask the sorts of questions that Peter talked about earlier. But do things have to be this way? Why are they this way? What are some alternative possibilities? And of course, linking quality literature with the other art forms is also incredibly important because it can enable us to become deeply literate. All of the other art forms are different ways of making meaning, therefore different kinds of literacies. And too often we've talked about literacy in this country in a very narrow and reductive way. The other thing that is really interesting is that the neuroscience tells us that shared reading of imaginative literature is done with our whole body. It's not just something that we're doing in the mind. The neuroscience tells us our body is actually enacting some of those things that you're reading about. Experiencing and exploring strategies of these expert writers and illustrators is also really important because they provide fabulous models for us, and we all need, to be able to story and write ourselves. So it's a really good starting point. I want to make a plea for real stories, not contrived stories that are just totally purpose-written, stories that come from the heart. Too often we have concentrated too much on very limited vocabulary, very simple grammar structures, etc., which don't actually make meaning beyond a sentence level. They're not going to actually challenge us socially and emotionally. And so I just wanted in my last minute or two to mention the concern that some people have, that should we do this kind of talking with very young children? Should children have a chance to be children and not have to, think about these huge dilemmas, crises, life issues? Of course we must. They're actually in them, experiencing them now as we speak. And it's really clear that they think about the huge life issues all the time, and they really want to engage with them. I have really interesting transcripts of where children in news time will bring up something, that's really been quite tragic or has traumatized them, and the teacher has changed the subject. So, yes, we do need to make sure that all of our children and young people and their parents have the opportunity to, if you like, discover both the pleasure and the absolute magic of reading imaginative fiction. So I'm going to stop there just to say that Helen reference to those young people starting university is really important. One of a huge memory for me is my early career, my pre-service teachers coming back from professional experience after 9/11. And they all wanted to talk about the different practices they'd seen in the classrooms when that had happened. You know, the teachers that just sat down and talked with the children about the images that they'd seen over and over again on the TV versus the teachers who ignored it completely. Obviously, teachers, you know their children well, but I think sometimes as adults, we don't give children and young people the opportunity to be actively engaged in talking and doing and being and becoming at these particular points of time in our histories.
Thanks, Robyn. I'm sure many of you will agree with me that the kinds of ideas that we've heard expressed today are really an act of hope, which really is what education and the arts are all about, that we are kind of trying to enact hope today. We're trying to think about how we can critically engage with these kinds of issues so that our young people and our old people and our older people and our school communities can really engage in kind of what is becoming, as many people have said, the new normal, and not kind of shutting it away and leaving people out, but engaging communities in the healing process, in the restoration process. We've got some time now for questions from the floor and from online, if there are any. You can still post questions online if you would like to. If you're going to ask a question from the floor, I'd ask you to come up and ask it from the microphone. We might start from a question from the floor if there are any. I've got one if no one else has one. But is there any questions out there that people want to ask? All right, I'm going to use my chairperson's prerogative and ask the first question. It's to Jane. What would you say, where is Jane? Can't say, oh, Jane, why don't you come up so you can answer up here and everyone can hear? So Jane, I'm thinking about the teachers who may be either in the room or listening online. What are the three things you would say to them about the first day, the first week, the first month?
Ooh. That's a big question.
And you've got, 3 minutes.
3 seconds. Know your kids would be my first one. Knowing your community, knowing your children, and going with, actually using your judgment. I was talking to someone earlier about growing into the position where I felt strong enough to say no to things that were being thrust upon us from on high and sideways and every which way, and really advocating for our students and our school and being strong enough to do that. So knowing your families, knowing your kids. Self-care is huge, and I've said this to many people in the last 11 years, it's the thing that I got least right, I think. We didn't stop, we didn't know how to do self-care, and the more time that went on, the worse we got at understanding what that involved. And I think that came at a big cost for our families. And I think it does impact on how well you do your job. I think being very, very flexible is key. Every day was different. It always is in teaching, but amp that up to the nth degree. Children work through their experiences and what they want to discuss, share, make sense of at very different stages. And sometimes it could be a year or 2 or 3 down the track that a student would first initiate a conversation and want to share. Not all students will want to engage with your specialist services that come through the door. It's a beautiful fit for some, not for others, so there's a bit of a trial and error approach, I think. I could go on for a long time there. Is that enough? Probably got plenty.
Any other questions from the floor? Yeah, if you want to come up and pass it into the microphone. So I think you can be picked up actually from there.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
A question for, I think, is it Peter?
The one with your back to. Yeah.
I really like what you said at the end of your talk about how the arts allow people to criticise the government for whatever gripe that they have. They use the arts to express their complaints. But how effective are those channels in facilitating change?
It depends, I guess, what we mean by effective, but the opportunities, the arts for me are always disruptive processes, which is why sometimes they're tricky in schools, because it's and they're tricky in the worlds in which we live, but that's part of their role and function, and they do challenge the way in which things are. My experience in Mexico City, for example, a city destroyed by an earthquake in pockets, and disasters often punish the poorest, and that's probably been the case here in Australia as well. And then government comes in and double punishes, and you can read lots about that from Naomi Klein and others. The importance of speaking back, regardless of whether or not it's effective, it's still important. And people will take the opportunity and will need to take the opportunity to do that. There's a whole discussion in this country about the reason why these fires are taking place. I'm not saying that that's what you need to be doing in the coming days, but the arts will be part of that counter-narrative, the narrative that your government might want to push about whether or not this is a natural disaster, and that the arts will take a lead role in those counter stories. Certainly in Christchurch, the continuing focus of the artists in drawing government and other people's attention to the plight of people in the eastern suburbs 10 years later is vitally important for community resilience. Their resilience depends actually on political resistance. In China, the groups that I worked with there, they were banned in the end from working in those disaster zones because they had a political choice to make. Did they tell those stories of the role of government in the disasters? And I was banned from China as well. But the importance of doing the work remains, whether or not it's effective, is the short answer.
Any other questions? Yeah.
It's a comment.
Just hang on for 2 seconds and we'll switch to your microphone.
Oh.
Yep.
Oh, okay. I was just going to make a comment there about the role of arts in education and recovery. I think it's also really important to focus on the role of the arts in kind of creating those innovative solutions when you're looking forward into what the future is going to look like for those children living in kind of hazard impacted areas. And it was something I kind of cut myself short, I think, earlier, but that's certainly something we try to celebrate through the Resilient Awards program. And I know that Jane's school's been very involved in that, but we see really great applications from around the country from schools using the arts to recover, but also to come up with those creative and innovative solutions around bringing communities together, or whether it be part of a kind of STEM approach where there's a local problem that they're trying to solve by spreading a message and using art to do that as well.
I think you make a great point, Richard, which is really a question about how we bring creativity to the centre of this question rather than to the periphery of it, and what role the arts have to play in making that part of the central business of schooling, actually. And not just as something trivial, but something that is actually core business for schools.
So I think that's a great point, Helen.
Can I build on that?
This is Helen Carter. Yeah.
The discussion. Just to say, I think we need to be aware also that the intersection between climate anxiety and the response to the bushfire is there, and clearly massively there for our young people, and particularly kids sort of from late years of primary school up through secondary. And one of the protective things is it's not highly protective to just be criticising what's going on around you. It's protective to find a connection between the micro and the macro. So the big macro forces of government, economy and media are circulating. But as we learned from feminists in the gender liberation movements, is that the micro is the macro. So when you find a micro act through which to make your place a better place, more humane, more healthy, more caring, and you get help to see the connection between your micro act and you are helping to change the world that you think is deeply wrong, that's protective for people. And that particularly adolescents find it hugely protective to be useful in some way in their immediate world. And it is the usefulness that also maintains hope, not just like the imagination on its own is great, but it's not enough. So I think we also need to understand that the arts are deeply political always, not just for dealing with the emotions, they're politicized, they're political. And that our politics, when we do just the politics of blame, we actually re-victimise ourselves. And being victimised is one of the things we need to get out of in recovery, is perceiving ourselves as a victim. So our educative mechanisms for doing that are really, really important. And we're not necessarily the best at this in the arts. Let's get clear on this. It's really easy to finger point through the arts. That's cheap. It's not so easy to enable through the arts, other than through the actual process of making the material. But let's not forget the audiences of the material didn't have the joy of making it. And any of that protective stuff. Are our arts-based messages doing good or harm to our audiences? Another thing we need to think about. So I just encourage you to maybe put that in that mix.
Julie.
I have a question for Helen. She raised the point, I think it's a really important one, which is about the fact that it's not just the kids in the communities that are directly affected, but just in talking to young people in my world that I'm coming across, it doesn't matter whether they're at the Gold Coast in a high-rise by the beach, they're feeling this in a massive way. So I'm wondering, Helen, if you... I'm also aware that the Mission Australia survey of young people has just found that it's quadrupled in terms of the issue of most importance for young people has risen from 9% to 34% climate. So this is a really big ticket item. So what advice do you have for people or anyone who's an expert in this for schools and teachers, secondary, primary, early childhood who are not in the zone about the extent to which they should emphasise, de-emphasise or whatever, not just in the first day back, but beyond. So in non-directly affected regions, even far-flung from them.
So Helen, can I ask you to restrict that question to your response to 2 minutes?
Please help me with that, Peter.
That'd be great.
Sorry, okay, try to be short. I think there are parallels with the 9/11, which was everybody's disaster, even though it wasn't everybody's. So being able to articulate that the world changed for us is important. But then what every teacher can do is advocate for us to do what we are directed to in the Australian and in our state curricula, which is provide for social emotional learning in our schools. What we know is primary teachers are pretty good at that, and in secondary teachers it's usually no home for it, it doesn't fit in health curricula. The personal and social capabilities remain distributed. In other words, nobody's responsibility but everybody's. This is the time to start to say, put this in the program and find some place where we explicitly do that. And the other thing is just to make the general tips and advice available for all teachers, like the first aid tips, stay calm, stay routine, stay on track, use positive feedback, scaffolded learning tasks, emphasise support for incremental learning, and do your best teaching practices. If you do nothing else, safe, purposeful, happy learning environment is objective. Just do that.
Thanks, Helen. That's pretty good for 2 minutes, I think. Thank you very much, everyone in the room and everyone who's joined us virtually. Thank you to Central Queensland University Sydney campus for hosting this event.
And the wonderful teaching technologies people.
And the technology people who've done a wonderful job keeping it all happening.
We'd also like to say this is the start of a conversation, not the end. As you can see, there's lots of open questions, lots of wonderings, lots of curiosities. So we hope that you will participate in your own context in the way that Helen's suggesting by thinking about how we can make communities part of the recovery and restoration process, and how the arts and creativity might be part of that process in a critical and thoughtful manner. So thank you very much to everyone who's been involved. Thanks for joining us online, those who've joined us online, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you. We do have one question from online, which we're going to sneak in quickly.
I'm just going to prioritise one.
Okay, so one of those questions is, do you want to read it out?
I'm just picking which one's going to be the most important, because there are a lot that came through right at the very end.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I think it's probably really important that this is an ongoing conversation.
Sure.
And people are looking for how they can access information, whether that be connecting with people who are spoken today, or getting the PowerPoint slides, or continuing finding more information. So what's the best way to do that?
Okay, Sue, do you want to respond to that?
The best way, I guess, initially we've got the first tranche of materials on the Arts Health Network site, but all of the other presenters and more, and also various education departments, etc., will all have their own resources. We've got the mailing list now for this event and those people who registered online, so we can send you an email with updates. So I imagine the PowerPoints will probably put up on that website, also on the Facebook group. We can put files there as well. So yes, and we'll build from those communities and bases, I think.
Fantastic. All right, thanks very much. That really is the end. So thank you for joining us, and thank you everybody in the room, and see you all soon.